Hey everyone, so today is the long-awaited day. We've talked a lot about this, we mentioned it at the beginning of the design course, but today is the day that we're finally going to start talking about tilted grid. We're going to learn what it is, how do we do it, cram as much as we can into this video about tilted grid. So let's go. So before we start, I want to give a quick plug to this book. It's called Origami Nature Study by Shuki Kato, and I believe this book is where the tilted grid designs first became noticed. I don't know if he was the very first designer to use it, but he's definitely the first one to become famous for it. And it doesn't teach you how to do tilted grid, but there are some really nicely done models in here. So if you want to fold some really difficult, complex models, I recommend this book. And even though it doesn't really explain too much about tilted grid, it was only after folding some of these models that I kind of picked it up for myself. So highly recommend this book. I'll have a link to the description where you can buy it. Not a sponsored video, by the way. So let's start talking about how do we design with the tilted grid. Here's some of the stuff we're going to talk about today. We're first going to answer some basic questions like what angle is the grid tilted at? How do we do that grid? How do we pre-crease it? How do we find that angle? Then we're going to talk about whether tilted grid is a form of box pleating or not, because that's a decent question. A lot of people don't seem to understand that. Then we're going to talk about the actual method of how do we design tilted grid. Now, of course, Shuki Kato probably has a different method, but this is from my experience. This is how I have done it. And once we understand that, then we can do some analysis about what does it mean to be more efficient, because that's thrown around a lot, but a lot of people don't really know what exactly does that mean. And then we'll talk about some of the pros and cons of using tilted grid versus other design methods. So, if you're not familiar, you don't know anything about what tilted grid is, here's two examples here. These are both my designs. So we have a puppy, and then we have this divine boar. So on the screen, I have the photos of the model, and also the crease patterns. So when you look at the photo, well, they just look like a normal animal, right? There are plenty of origami animals out there from box pleating 22.5 and so on. But when you look at the crease pattern is when you really start to see what's going on. Because you see on the crease pattern, there is a grid, and the creases do look pretty parallel to each other, but the square is tilted, right? It's not normal, right? So when you first start out on tilted grid, it's going to feel really weird, and it does take a while to get used to. But here's the basic idea. It's a grid that's tilted. So the question is, what angle do we tilt the grid? So the answer is we actually don't really tilt it at an angle. We tilt it at a slope. And the reason why that is because if we have a grid on our crease pattern, if we tilt it at an angle like 22.5 or 30 or 60 or something like that, those angles, the slope of those angles are irrational. And so what's going to end up happening is that the grid lines will never lie. It's just going to be a whole mess. So just trust me on this one, we'll use slopes. And slope, I mean, hopefully you've taken high school math. The line, like a diagonal line along a grid. So I have three squares on the screen, and one is tilted at a slope of 2, one is tilted at a slope of 2, one is tilted at a slope of 3, and one is tilted at a slope of 4. Now, the majority of tilted grid models, there's a few exceptions, but the majority are diagonal symmetry. So for each of the three squares, I've drawn the diagonal line of symmetry. Now, what do we notice about this line of symmetry? Well, on the slope of 2, the diagonal line of symmetry lies on grid points 5 times. And then the slope of 3 lies on the grid 7 times for basically the same size square. And the slope of 4, the midline only lies on the grid twice for the same size square. So hopefully you can kind of see where we're going here. We almost always tilt it at a slope of 3 because that allows our diagonal midline to lie on the grid points. And the more it lies on the grid points, the easier it is to fold, easier it is to design, easier it is to pre-crease. Everything's so much more easier if we have it lie on the grid points. Now, of course, we could tilt it at any angle we want with the same method. And you'll see what I mean later, but just for now, we're almost always going to be using the slope of 3 just because it's easier to fold. And that's quite an important aspect of design too. Last thing I want to mention about this, so I call it slope of 3 just now, but sometimes you'll hear arctan thrown around. So if you remember back from high school trigonometry, you'll know that arctan is basically a function that converts slope into angle. So for example, if you're trying to tilt your square in Origami or some other software and you need an angle, then you would have to use the arctan of 3 to input the slope of 3. So that's basically what it means. And arctan of 3, when you put it in your calculator, it's about 18 degrees. So but we think in slope, not angles. Okay, the second question is, how do we pre-crease a tilted grid? How do we use this arctan3 to make a grid? Now this is one of the things you can easily learn from Shuki Kato's book, because all of his tilted grid designs, you just follow the first few steps and he'll show you how to make the tilted grid for that model. But I'll give you a quick run through here that I drew myself. So first we're going to fold the diagonals. Then we're going to fold the corners in on 3 of the corners. And then we'll make these lines that go from the corner down to the intersections we just made. And these lines are at a slope of 3. If you do the math, you'll see what I mean. And then finally we do these other 2 diagonal lines which are perpendicular to the ones before. And now we have everything we need to do our grid. So all of the horizontal lines of our tilted grid are going to be parallel with the lines we made in step 3. And all of our vertical lines of our tilted grid are going to be parallel with the lines we made in step 4. Next question that I see all the time. Is tilted grid a form of box pleating? And the answer is quite complicated. So let's just first talk about what is box pleating. What makes a crease pattern box pleating or not? Well, one basic definition is it's on a grid, and the majority of creases are either at 90 degrees from each other or 45 degrees from each other. But then there's this distinction that a lot of people don't quite get. There is axial box pleating, also known as uniaxial box pleating, and then there's unaxial, which is also known as non-uniaxial. And what does that mean? So for now, it doesn't quite matter what an axis is, but basically remember this. So axial box pleating is the normal box pleating we've been doing this whole series. So if you're wondering what axial box pleating is, you're in luck because we got a whole bunch of videos about it. So, you start with the tree and then you pack it using BP Studio or by hand. Once you have a packing of all your flaps and rivers and stuff, you then fold it. You have a stick figure that you can shape. A good example of axial box pleating is this Galofa beetle designed by my friend Drew Heskett. So you see how you start with the tree and then you pack it and then you fold it into a stick figure, shape it, and so on. So the axial box pleating is one thing. And then we have unaxial box pleating. And unaxial box pleating is basically anything that fits the definition of box pleating, like it lies on a grid, but it doesn't fit the definition of axial box pleating. So there's no tree, there's no packing, there's no rivers, there's no flaps, it just lies on a grid and does its own thing, right? So a few other examples are Robert Lang's Black Forest Cuckoo Clock, Robert Lang's Organist. A lot of tessellations are unaxial box pleating. And the one that I have on the screen is here is an interesting one, because this is it's my, we'll say, translation of Shuki Kato's tilted grid bison onto a regular grid. And you see there's no tree, it's not a stick figure, there's no flaps, there's no rivers, it just lies on a grid. Now, with these 2 definitions in mind, we have the definition of axial versus non-axial, and then we have the definition of what is box pleating in general. Let's take another look at our tilted grid crease pattern examples. So the first question is it box pleating? So does it lie on a grid? Well, it certainly does, right? Most of the creases are at 90 or 45 degree angles from each other. So yes, it is definitely box pleating. But then the second question, is it axial box pleating? Now, do we see a tree? Do we see packings, rivers, flaps? No, we don't. It's not axial. So we would say that tilted grid is unaxial box pleating. All right, so now I have here another example. So this is a, kind of like a bodybuilder bob dummy. It's a dummy, sort of. It's basically a proof of concept. It's not an actual model. But I have here on the screen 3 different crease patterns. I only folded the second one, but Orihime folded the other 3. And what do you notice about these? Well, for the 3 folded models, they look about the same, right? They have the same muscle structures and stuff. But for the 3 crease patterns, you'll see that the first one is on a normal grid, the second one is on a diagonal grid, and the third one is on a tilted grid. And look at that. They all, even though they're on different grids, they all end up with about the same product. And that kind of goes back with the Shuki Kato bison thing that I mentioned earlier. When I said translation because the finished product looks quite similar to the tilted grid version. Except that, mine was on a normal grid, his was on a tilted grid. And so if there's one thing you take away from this video, is that just because it's on a tilted grid doesn't mean that it's completely different. It's not actually that different from unaxial box pleating, which, again, you might not be familiar with unaxial box pleating, but sometimes when people look at a tilted grid, they'd be like, oh man, what's going on? It's so scary, right? But when they look at, a normal grid, like if you saw this first one here, or if you saw my normal grid bison, they're not as scary, right? So my hope for you for this video, if you take nothing away, is that tilted grid is actually not as scary as it looks. It's not too different from doing stuff on a normal grid. Okay, now that you know a little bit of background about what is tilted grid and what is some of the properties of this method, let's go and talk about how do you actually do this? What is the method? So step one. So just like any other design method, we're going to have a subject. So in this case, we're going to have a kangaroo, and I pulled up an image from Wikipedia or somewhere, or Google Images, and that's our subject. That's what we want to design. Our next step is to draw an abstraction, and we'll talk about this in just a second. But an abstraction is basically you're going to want to imagine that you had the folded model, and you try to unshape it. And then we're going to pack it. Now, this is not packing in the way we used to say. This is not packing flaps and rivers, this is packing polygons, which is, again, I'll explain it just a sec, but this is just an overview. So we're going to pack the abstraction into a crease pattern. And then, once you have your crease pattern, you're going to fold it up into a base, shape it, and you have your final model. Now, folding tilted grid crease patterns is actually really hard. I'm going to be honest, it's like I tried, even after having designed some of my own, I went and tried to fold some of Shuki Kato's crease patterns, and they stumped me. Like they're hard. I don't really have much advice except that when you're designing your own thing, it's kind of like it's like your child. You really understand it. So when you're folding your own crease pattern, it's not going to be nearly as hard as folding someone else's crease pattern. So I don't think I can talk too much about folding tilted grid crease patterns in this video, but if you ever get stuck, there's the Discord and the link in the description. You can ask me any question anytime, and we'll be happy to help. So then once you've folded your base, you're then going to shape it. And again, shaping is also hard to really teach. Shaping is one of those things that you just gain from experience. So, but shaping is also one of those things when you're shaping your own model, it's like a child, you understand exactly how it's supposed to go. So it's not too bad. So this video, we're going to be talking about the abstraction and the packing. That's the main thing. The other two steps, the folding and the shaping, those are for you to exercise for the reader, so to speak. Okay, abstraction. So the way I think of an abstraction, it's the abstraction is what do you want your crease pattern to fold into. So here I have the real thing, the real kangaroo, and then I have the abstraction, which is just like a line drawing that I did before the crease pattern. Then I have the folded model, so when I put the crease pattern into the software, I have it folded for me. What is the output? So that's the thing down in the bottom left. And then I have the folded model. So what do you notice about the abstraction compared to the folded model? They look kind of similar, right? Not identical, but basically your goal of the crease pattern is to make the crease pattern look like your abstraction. So your abstraction is kind of like a starting point. It's kind of like a way for you to organize what does your crease pattern need to look like. So how do you come up with the abstraction? So earlier I said it's kind of like unshaping. And let's talk about what I mean by that. So for example, and this comes with the shaping experience, but for example, we know that if we have a leg, we know that we can easily thin the leg at the feet, right? That's something you can do in shaping. But it's very hard to thicken it up here for the waist. So if you're unshaping it, you would think, okay, well, I know I can thin the legs later, so the opposite of that would be to thicken the legs. So for that reason, on the abstraction, I made the legs 2 units thick all the way down, because I know that later I can shape it into a thinner leg. Same thing for like the front arms, right? I know, okay, when I'm shaping it, I can bend the arms and bend the fingers and stuff. So to unshape it would mean to make the arm straight. And so you see on the abstraction, the front arm is straight down. And so that's kind of what I mean, And honestly, to be honest, like drawing a good abstraction for your design idea is actually, like, don't underestimate it. It's actually quite difficult to do. Having a good tilted grid idea and drawing a good abstraction is a lot harder than it is for just drawing a tree on axial box pleating. Because the other thing you need to take care of, so with a tree, all you need to take care of is like the lengths of each flap and river and where is it coming out of. But with an abstraction, it doesn't just matter the length of your flap, the length of your thing. Like for example, the leg, it's not only just how long the leg is, but also how wide is it, because an abstraction is two-dimensional, right? It's composed of polygons. So for example, a wide polygon for the back leg, right? Or a thin polygon for the front leg. So yeah, there's a lot to take care of. There's a lot of things that you need to take into consideration when you're drawing your abstraction. Okay, so let's let's talk about this guy. Let's talk about this guy's abstraction, another example. So I don't have a subject photo. I looked up some fantasy art thing on Google Images because this is actually not super realistic. But you do see the line drawing in the top left. And that was the abstraction that I used before I drew the crease pattern. So, and now I said the abstraction was composed of polygons, right? So for the last example, we had like a pentagon for the leg. Here, I want you to pay close attention to some of the polygons. So for example, for the chest muscle, we have some pentagons on the abstraction. Then we have like the little squares for each square for the ab muscles. So we have those on the abstraction. We have the big wide one for the base of the dummy. So if the tree from axial box pleating is made up of branches and leaves, the abstraction is going to be made out of polygons. And then I have here the crease pattern for the dummy. I want you to look what happens to the polygons. So for example, you see that kind of irregular pentagon we have for the chest? Do you see where that ended up on the crease pattern? And do you see like the 6 little squares that we have on the abstraction? Do you see where those ended up on the crease pattern? This is starting to get into what I meant about packing. So in axial box pleating, we're going to pack each flap. So like the leg is going to go in the corner, the head is going to go in the other corner, stuff like that, right? We pack flaps. Here we pack polygons. So we'd say, okay, my chest muscle is going to go in the middle, the 6 little squares for the abs are going to go underneath that, the base thing is going to go at the bottom. That's what we mean by packing polygons. The other thing you got to notice is that the polygons are overlapping a bit, okay? So for example, right, you see how the chest polygon is overlapping a little bit on the top of the 6-pack. So if you look at the crease pattern, you'll see that that chest polygon, that pentagon, is going to be overlapping over the square a little bit. Is this kind of making sense? You have to really, if you're used to axial box pleating, you really have to kind of rethink everything. Everything is completely new. So I just mentioned something about overlapping polygons, packing polygons, all that. What am I talking about? So to show you what I mean, we're going to do a quick exercise. So what I want you to do is pause the video and fold an 8x8 grid on, just like scratch paper, printer paper, kame, something. So these 2 squares here, that is our abstraction. Now our goal is to make the crease pattern for this abstraction. So what have we basically been talking about just now? Fold your 8x8 grid into this shape. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, don't worry, I'll explain it and I'll go over it in just a sec. But I want to give you a chance to figure it out for yourself. So take your 8x8 grid, fold that shape, the 2 squares. Okay, let's talk about how do we get that. So I'm going to show the crease pattern on the screen. Hopefully, if you're watching this, you know how to do crease patterns. Otherwise, you're in the wrong class. So there's the crease pattern. Now, this crease pattern shows you how do we get those 2 polygons on the screen. How do we have them overlap? So it's quite simple. You can probably figure out intuitively. Collapse this crease pattern a little bit. Now you see that the 2 squares are on the paper. The corners are overlapping like they're supposed to. And we're on our way, right? Now, if you didn't notice from this crease pattern, the squares from the abstraction, this is where they ended up. They're dotted in yellow, so hopefully you can see. But there's something that came up that we didn't foresee. Because now, what are we missing? Does this look exactly like the figure up there? No, it doesn't. So what we have to do now is we have to remove these negative spaces in the back. So the way we do that is also quite intuitive, right? There's you can probably figure it out just by messing around with it. We're just going to swivel things. In this case, it was easy to remove the negative space. And here we have our folded figure. So hopefully that kind of gave you a sense of what it means. All right, now I know we're using a normal grid. We're not using a tilted grid, but I want you to kind of get a feel for what is it like to be designing with tilted grid. So I'm going to show you another challenge that you're going to see if you start doing tilted grid design. This is something you're going to see really quick. So this was an easy example. This is probably the easiest example there is. Let's try a slightly harder one. So this abstraction is also folded from an 8x8 grid. So you can unfold your old one or get a new paper, make an 8x8 grid, and your goal is to do what we did last time. Last time we used 4x4 squares. This time we have 2 3x5 rectangles that are overlapping. So go ahead and pause the video, try to fold the abstraction there. Okay, so step 1 is quite easy, right? It's kind of what we did last time. I'm not going to dot in yellow the 2 polygons here, but hopefully you can kind of see where this came from. It's not too crazy, right? But here's the kicker. How do we remove the negative space around these 2 rectangles? In the bottom right is a piece of cake. It's just a little swivel fold and it's out. But in the top left, we can't, it's kind of webby, right? How do we get rid of this negative space? Now you can fiddle around with it on your paper, see if you can figure it out. You probably couldn't mush it, right? That's definitely possible, but we want to figure out how do we do it without mush. Chances are this is where you got stuck. Now it turns out that we can remove this negative space using a Pythagorean stretch. And I don't have time to talk about how this Pythagorean stretch works because the backstory for return is quite complicated. But just know that one, it's very different from the axial box, like the Pythagorean stretches we just talked about in BP Studio and all that, completely different. I just wanted to show you that this is a thing. Pythagorean stretches in tilted grid they do exist. But again, maybe in a future video. But in the meantime, even if you don't know how to get into this crazy Python stuff, there is a way without Pythagorean stretches to remove this negative space. Okay, first thing, we need to understand why were we not able to remove the negative space in that example. And the reason why, it goes back to what Robert Lang calls is the fundamental theorem of origami design. And I have it up on the screen, you can read it out. But it says that the distance between 2 points on the crease pattern must be greater than or equal to the distance between those 2 points on the folded figure. So what does that mean? So in the context of axial box fitting, let's say I have these two legs, right? This is the dodo skeleton, I've got two legs. Let's say the legs are 8 units each, okay? And so that means the distance from one toe to the other toe is 16 units, right? If each leg is 8 units, it's going to be 8 units to go up, 8 units to go down. So if you're an ant walking from one toe to the other foot, one foot to the other foot, then you have to do 16 units. And so what Lang's rule tells you is that on the crease pattern, the distance between this leg flap and this leg flap needs to be at least 16 units apart. So back to our problem here. So if you're an ant walking from this corner to this corner, so from one rectangle to the other rectangle, how many units would you have to go? Well, there's 3 units down here to the corner, and another 3 units here. And since we took a concave turn, we have to add another unit. So just trust me on this. We're gonna say 3 plus 3 plus 1 for this concave turn. So basically we need our distance between this point and this point to be 7 units on the crease pattern. Now, when we look at the crease pattern, we can look at the Pythagorean theorem. So if you're an ant going diagonally from one corner to the other, how many units would that be? Well, that's just 5 times the square root of 2, which is greater than 7. So if we were using the diagonal path, the most direct path, it would be long enough to remove all the negative space. And that's basically what the Pythagorean stretch does. The Pythagorean stretch allows the ant to walk diagonally. But without the Pythagorean stretch, if we don't know how to do that yet, we're limited to just the horizontal distance or the vertical distance, not both. So it's not 5 plus 5 is a 10 unit long path, it's 5 or 5. And so either way, it's not long enough, and that's why we end up with this webby thing. Because think like, if there's a little web, there's a shorter path for the ant to walk, so it doesn't need to be 7 years long, it can be shorter if there's a little webby part. So what is the solution to this? So here I have this folded figure that we have earlier without the negative space removed. Currently, the horizontal distance is 5, and the vertical distance is 5. And we need one of those to be at least 7. So how do we increase the distance between the two circled points? Well, we just move the polygons apart. So we can literally cut the crease pattern in half, move them 2 units apart, and then the distance is now 5 plus 2 is 7. And so the horizontal distance between the two circle points now is 7 units. And so if we follow along with this crease pattern, just fill in that gap with the pleat, fold through the layers, we find that we're now able to remove the negative space without a Pythagorean stretch. Now, obviously I can't see you guys' faces. I don't know if that made any sense or not, but if it didn't, try folding it. I have the crease pattern up on the screen. Pause the video, take your 8x8 grid, and try folding it in. Hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense. And if it doesn't make a little bit more sense, at the very least, I hope that it gave you kind of a sense for what do you have to deal with when you're designing tilted grid, or unaxial box pleating for that matter. Because the main challenge is getting rid of all the negative space. Now, you might be wondering, right, the two challenges we just did, right, with the rectangles, they were both on regular grids, right? And you might be wondering, well, what does this have anything to do with tilted grid? Now here on the screen, I've got the kangaroo crease pattern up, and I want you to look closely. So pause the video, take a look. I want you to see where in the crease pattern do you see that trick we just did with, adding that pleat down the middle to create more negative space? Take a close look, see if you can find it. So if you couldn't find it, here's where it was. And it was used to get more negative space between, all the space between these two legs. There's a lot of negative space. And so having that extra pleat there, having that little trick allowed me to not make it webby here. It would be very strange if they had webbed arms. So hopefully that shows you that they're kind of related, right? Everything is related. So before we go and analyze the efficiency and stuff like that, let's just review the method. So step 1 is to find the subject. So we have a kangaroo, a bodybuilder, bison, whatever. Step 2 is we're going to draw the abstraction. So it's kind of like as if we're unshaping the photo model. We need to know, what does our base look like? What does our crease pattern need to look like? And what are the polygons that are going to compose the base? That's our abstraction. Step 3 is we're going to pack that abstraction onto a crease pattern. So every polygon, so every leg, polygon, muscle, chest, whatever, needs to end up on the crease pattern. And they need to end up in a way that they're going to be positioned relative to the other polygons. So whether that be like a corner overlap or side-by-side overlap or whatever, they just need to be positioned correctly. And then also part of that process is removing the negative space. So removing the space between polygons is quite a challenge, but that's basically how it goes. Then after that, we're going to collapse the crease pattern, fold it, and so on. Okay, let's talk about what does it mean to be efficient. Now that's a word that's thrown around all the time in terms of origami. People will just be like, oh yeah, more efficient. So what does it mean? So efficiency refers to the ratio between the folded model size and the initial paper size. So for example, imagine I took a paper that was a huge piece of paper and folded it up into some tiny little thing. That's very inefficient. But on the other hand, if I had like a decent sized paper, and then when I fold it down, it's actually not that much smaller, that's very efficient. So I have here again the 3 versions of the bodybuilder. We have the normal grid version, the diagonal grid version, and the tilted grid version. And you can look at their different foldings, their folded model size. The regular grid version is the smallest because it's the least efficient. Diagonal grid is pretty good, it's a little bit bigger, and then the tilted grid version is slightly better than that. And it turns out that a lot of the time, the tilted grid version is a little bit more efficient. That's just how it is. However, do note that, this one that I folded was the diagonal grid, the second one, that's slightly less efficient. It's much more easier, so, efficiency is not the only thing that matters. Also, the folding sequence and how annoying it is to fold, that's also important too. So, just because it's more efficient doesn't mean that you have to fold it that way or design it that way. Here's another visualization of the efficiency. So I have the tilted grid puppy, and then I have the translated it onto a normal grid. Now what do you notice about the normal grid puppy? I've also highlighted it where all the polygons are, and you notice that the normal grid puppy, there's a lot of blank spaces everywhere. That's what makes it inefficient. And so it just so happens that the shape of the puppy kind of fits a tilted grid a little bit better, and there's less blank space, and that's why it's much more efficient. So kind of as another rough comparison, you kind of tell whether it's better to do tilted grid or normal grid, whether the model roughly fits a triangle or rectangle. Now this is, very rough. But for example, like the kangaroo, it kind of fits a triangle, especially if the tail is pointed up. It's kind of a triangle-y shape. Whereas the bison is kind of big and strong, and it's kind of rectangular. It's tall in the back and tall in the front, so it's rectangular. And that's why, the bison's regular grid version is not that bad. It's actually pretty good. I think it's a little bit less efficient than Shuki Kato's tilted grid bison, but they're pretty close. Okay, overall, now that we understand all this, let's take a look at the pros and cons of tilted grid. So the pros, number 1, it's efficient. So that means that you can use thick papers, you can use smaller papers and still have decently sized models, right? It's just more elegant, right? We just kind of talked about that. The second reason is that it's very good for organic shapes. So, like soft little puppies and kangaroos and stuff like that. And so the reason why that is because we're not doing stick figures like we are in axial box pleating, we're doing polygons. So we are able to do big, wide, soft, smooth surfaces rather than everything is a stick. So it's very good for organic and animals and stuff. The last pro, which is not going to be really the case anymore, is that it's still unexplored, right? Like the number of people who can do tilted grid, you probably count them on your fingers, right? There's not a lot of people as of when I'm making this video at least. So, if you're looking to do something unique, something that very few people have done before, I think there's probably hundreds of people who have done box pleating in 22.5 before. The tilted grid is very new. Not a lot of people have done it. So if being unique is something you care about, I'm just saying, like, you know, some of the downsides. So it has very limited shaping freedom. And now let me explain what that means. And this is what you get. This is the trade-off for efficiency. Now I'll show you on the kangaroo, because but basically when you have an axial box pleating, you have a stick figure, right? And the stick becomes like an arm, and you're able to move that. The arm is like completely free to flap around. That's why we call them flaps, right? Because they flap. But on a tilted grid, we don't have flaps and reverse. We just have polygons. So what you'll notice is that it's kind of locked, right? This arm does not have and it's not because it's glued. It's because that's just how things are. This arm is not a flap. It's just a polygon. And so it doesn't have a hinge. It doesn't have a hinge to flap around, and neither does the back leg. So that's kind of what I mean by limited shaping freedom. So if you wanted to like pose it like this or like this, you wouldn't be able to. It's kind of locked in place because there's no hinges on the flaps. Now a lot of subjects aren't suitable. So like I said, you know, we're not doing stick figures. We're doing, you know, solid shapes. So stuff like beetles and skeletons, even human figures to some degree are just kind of not a good choice for tilted grid, right? It's just another tool. It's like using a fork to eat soup, right? I mean, tilted grid is good for some stuff. Axial box pleating is good for other stuff, right? And it just turns out that tilted grid is a little bit less versatile, in my opinion. Also, another way to think about it is the more negative space you have, the more annoying it's going to be to deal with it. So think like the space between two insect legs. There's a lot of negative space there. So doing an insect or something with a lot of spikes is going to be very difficult. And lastly, hopefully you've noticed this by now, but tilted grid is just hard, okay? I mentioned earlier the crease patterns are hard to fold. It's hard to shape, as I just explained. Hard to design, as I'm sure you've kind of been confused throughout this video. It's just hard, okay? So it takes a long time to get good at, and the results are pretty good, but is it worth it? That's up to you. Okay, homework challenges. So I've got 3 challenges here. Like I said earlier, trying to draw a good abstraction for a design idea is actually pretty hard. So I've just kind of made something up just so you can practice the technical aspect. But if you have a good idea, if you have a good abstraction, feel free to go for that. But if you're just looking for something to do to test out your skills and polygon overlaps and negative space and stuff, you can try to do these abstractions. So the top one is just kind of a regular unaxial box pleating. So you're going to use a 12 by 12 grid for this first one, and 12 by 12 square. And the back side is going to look weird. It's only need to look good from the front. The second challenge, the second one is it's on a normal grid. It's on a normal 16 by 16 grid, but it's diagonal symmetry. Not a diagonal grid. It's just a normal grid, diagonal symmetry. See if you can figure that one out. And once you got that one, it should lead very nicely into the last one. Now this last one is the key. If you can do this third challenge, you are a legend. Because at the start of this video, you didn't know how to do tilted grid. But at the end of this video, if you can follow that last challenge, you've now designed a tilted grid model, right? Now let me just say that these 3 problems are probably the hardest challenges that are given, like the Pythagorean stretch homeworks and the level shifters homework. Those are all easy. These 3 are quite difficult. You're basically designing your own thing for nothing. So don't be discouraged if you get stuck. Do join the Discord server and let me know if you have any questions. I'll be there to help you out with anything. Before we wrap up this video, which is already super long, I just want to mention that this is probably going to be the last design class video for a while. Yeah, pretty soon it's college time, boys and girls. So pretty soon I'm not going to have any time or space or stuff to make these videos. So thank you for sticking with me so far and all the way through this video and through the whole series. I haven't said enough, but you know, it really makes a difference when you guys watch the videos and comment and participate. Because otherwise, you know, there's no point. So thank you so much for sticking through to the end of the course with me. I do hope that you have learned stuff. Hopefully this is not the last video forever. I mean, I'm not going to radio silent, right? Maybe in a few months or so, or in a few years or so, I'll come back and make more stuff. You know, there's a lot more to talk about. We've got, you know, hex pleating, we got human figures, color changes, a lot of stuff I really want to talk about, but didn't have the chance to this past year. So do stay tuned for that. Subscribe. It might be a while, but I am looking forward to doing these more videos in the future. Just for now, this is kind of the last one for going to be for a while. Season 1, we'll say. anyways, I'll still be in the Discord and everything, so I'll see you around, alright? And yeah, it's been an absolute blast, so thank you all so much again. So some of you might be wondering, like, how did I get this beautiful white background? Am I using like a green screen or whatnot? The answer is actually really simple. Let me just show you. So this is actually just my bedroom window. The shades are down. It's like late afternoon. You know, that's it. I just stand in front of my window, turn up the exposure. Look at that. It's crazy, right?